Good afternoon. I'm welcoming you all on behalf of the Polish Institute of International Affairs Brussels office. I'm Lukasz Jurcin, and I have the pleasure to manage it. I would like to welcome especially our honorable panelists, Mr. Pascal Lamy, Vice President of Jacques Delors, and Mikhail Kurtaka, Polish Minister for Environment and Climate, and our dear moderator, Kate Abnett, Brussels climate correspondent for Reuters. Thank you so much one more time for accepting our invitation. What is more, Mr. Minister, we are immensely grateful that you join us in this very busy day for you, straight away from your swearing-in ceremony as a member of the new Polish government. So thank you one more time, and congratulations also. Before giving the floor to our dear moderator, I would like to thank also Jacques Delors for co-organizing this discussion. This is our first cooperation and at the Brussels level, and we are very delighted particularly that we launched this institutional cooperation with this capital topic, the future of the European climate transition, challenged by the COVID-19. Kate, the floor is yours now, and I wish you all a fascinating discussion. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lukasz. I'm pleased to welcome so many of you to what should be a vibrant exchange between these two distinguished speakers on the European Green Deal. So, as many of you know, the European Commission unveiled its European Green Deal last December. This is the EU's flagship policy package for tackling climate change, and it centres around a goal to cut EU greenhouse gas emissions to net zero by 2050. When the Commission unveiled its Green Deal last year, it called it a new growth strategy for Europe. And it said that the plan would require every sector to transform, from industry to agriculture to transport, but that this transformation was an opportunity to create lasting jobs and make economic sectors fit for the future. Now, much has changed since the Green Deal was unveiled. The coronavirus pandemic has brought huge human suffering and an economic shock beyond anything seen in the EU's history. But the Commission's message that the Green Deal is a growth plan hasn't changed. And the Commission has doubled down on this in recent months, saying that it will use climate change policies to help create jobs and drive Europe's economic recovery from the pandemic. It's pressing ahead with those new policies now. Last month, the Commission unveiled a more ambitious 2030 climate target for the EU. European Parliament is voting on that in a few hours today, and member states will also need to agree on it by the end of the year. So to discuss these issues, we're lucky to be joined by two prestigious speakers representing the view from Poland and France, two countries who are key to these discussions. Mikhail Kurtaka is Poland's climate minister in charge of climate and energy policy. He is also responsible for the country's environment policy after the government merged its climate and environment ministries last month. He's a familiar face at international climate negotiations and presided over the UN's annual climate summit in 2018, which took place in Katowice, Poland. Pascal Lamy is also with us, the Vice President of the think tank Europe Jacques Delors, which is the Brussels sister organization of the Jacques Delors Institute in Paris and the Jacques Delors Center in Berlin. He has held many high-level roles, including from 2005 to 13, when Mr. Lamy was the Director General of the World Trade Organization. And before that, he was European Commissioner in charge of international trade. I'll now hand over to our panelists to deliver their opening remarks. We'll follow that with a discussion and take questions from the audience. So if you'd like to ask either of our panelists a question, you can start posting your questions now. To do that, you just need to go to the YouTube live stream for the event and post your question in the comments section. Minister Kurtaka, I will hand over to you now. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. It has been indeed a very exceptional moment for myself, as I have just been confirmed as Minister of Climate and Environment. So I remain the first and the last, for the moment, Polish Minister of Climate, as we have increased the portfolio to cover also environmental issues. So from Minister of Climate, I moved to become just an hour ago Minister of Climate and Environment, and I'm happy to share this moment with you. And thank you very much for organizing this debate. Thank you for Łukasz, for the PISM Brussels team. And thank you very much. I'm glad to have the great honor to see distinguished Europeans. And Pascal Lamy is a role model of a European. Thank you very much for participating in this event with me. And I'm very pleased and honored that we will be able to share a couple of thoughts on this topic. So just very in a general term, I think that we are right now moving towards climate neutrality within the European Union to reach by 2050 climate neutrality. It both gives a sense to the European project. It has been put at the heart of the new Commission by Commissioner President van der Leyen. And at the same time, it's an enormous, unprecedented civilizational, industrial, societal change that we are facing, and which will have long-lasting consequences for the way our civilization will be functioning in the 21st century. So indeed, it's an enormous challenge that we are all facing and that we embark as the continent. And the moment of COVID, the pandemic, showed us different things. First of all, showed us how close we are to one to the other geographically, in the times when plane travels become much more complicated. It's easier to get from Copenhagen via Berlin to Szczecin, a journey that was made last week by my colleague and friend, Vice Minister of Energy and Climate from Danish government, than to go from Denmark to Taiwan or to China. So we are closer than we think sometimes. And also we are faced with a world which has changed enormously in terms of ability to trade, in terms of industrial value chains. Something which is far from Europe is very frequently much more difficult to access. And this was in a very practical way at the beginning of COVID, also impacting, for example, renewable investments here in Poland, as majority of components are manufactured in China when we are speaking about, for example, PV panels. So of course, an enormous challenge, an enormous also societal laboratory which we were living, and we had a number of reflections in our families. Whether do we need all these travels by plane? Do we need all this shopping that we are doing so much? And we did such a study among Polish citizens. And we found really the confirmation of these intuitions, that people indeed realized that some of the goods and services they associated with growth, with consumerism, are not anymore necessary. So that's on this side. On the other side, European Green Deal, COVID has also exposed weaknesses of our societies, of the level of preparedness of our industries, of our economies. And I'm afraid we are only at the beginning of the journey, as we can probably expect also that customers' expectations, investment moods will be impacted by COVID in the coming months in the wrong direction. So all this needs to be taken into account, and European Green Deal is a project, as I said, flagship project for Europe. But with COVID, somehow it got a new momentum with the recovery plan. It's interesting to see how much this pandemic, this tragedy, has somehow cemented Europeans around the idea that if we want to find ourselves in this more and more multilateral, multipolar world, and all these poles are outside of Europe right now, it's much more Asia and Americas than Europe, then we need really to mobilize our resources and to put them on the project that we have. And this is European Green Deal, and that is reaching climate neutrality by 2050, which mobilizes our resources. So if we want to be successful, I think we have to keep the momentum around three success conditions, three important issues that are key to my mind. First of all is competitiveness of EU industry. Europe has been born very much out of fossil fuels. All our big industries are energy-intensive industries, and the last big industry, which is export in the European export industry, traditional one is cars, and this will be profoundly impacted by coming technologies, especially electromobility and hydrogen mobility. So if we want to succeed, the European Green Deal, if we want to succeed on this bet of reaching climate neutrality, European industrial competitiveness is at the heart. We must do everything we can in order to preserve it, in order to build it. If we have issues related with financing, let's erase them. If we think if we have difficulties over state aid rules, let's not spend too much time, but also solve these issues. If we consider that ETS, European Trading Scheme, requires a reform, let's do it, because we need a competitive European industry on our journey to climate neutrality. I'm not advocating for a comeback to ancient technologies, just on the contrary, but let's put the right momentum on the creation of new jobs and creation of new sectors. The second difficulty that I think we are faced with is the fact that going to climate neutrality is not a journey which we have the pleasure to start from the same point. There are regions, there are countries, there are societal groups which are poorer than others. And we need to take this into account, and we need to address it. We call this dimension a just transition, of course, but really putting at the heart of this climate neutrality peoples and different societal groups, I think is a must. When I was running COP24 in Katowice, I witnessed on the streets of Paris, where 3 years before Paris Agreement was signed, 200,000 people in December 2018 were protesting against an increase of taxes on fuel. And this was the Gilets jaunes movement, Yellow Jackets movement. which exposed, which revealed a completely new stakeholder in the area of this climate and ecological transition, which were yellow vests. Traditionally, we were rather thinking of Polish miners in Silesia, which were the biggest stakeholder in this regard. But I think that it's not yet finished, and many groups will be also in discussion. And we need to make sure that there is no increase in energy poverty, there is no increase in poverty, and that poor regions can really cope with this capital-intensive revolution. Because this is a capital-intensive movement which we are faced with. We are moving from labor and natural resource-intensive economies to capital-intensive solutions. So we need to make sure that capital, money is available and cheap enough for all participants in this game. And last but not least, I think that we need to make sure that European concept of climate neutrality is also a role model for the world, and it's not something which I would call egoistic. Why? If we define climate neutrality as not producing goods and services on the territory of European Union member states, but we are saying nothing about not consuming these goods and solutions, then we risk to have our industries outsourcing dirty productions outside of European Union, jobs as well, but nothing will change within European Union, nothing will change in terms of global emissions. And last but not least, Europe will not be the leader it deserves to and it ambitions to for the rest of the world in terms of dragging them behind European model of reaching climate neutrality. So we must make sure that it's a model which builds European competitiveness, which takes care of the poorest, and which is a role model for the rest of the world. I think that after COVID, all these dimensions have become only more exacerbated, and that with recovery fund, we can tackle them, provided that we have really a very closely managed economic policy on the European Union level, that we work together and that we join our forces in this enormous economic and societal transformation that we are faced with. Last sentence.
Minister, I'm sorry to cut you off there, if I may. We're on quite a tight schedule, and I'd like to make sure that Mr. Lamy has time for remarks and our audience have time for questions. So if I may, I will pass the floor to Pascal Lamy. Thank you, Mr. Lamy. The floor is yours. Mr. Lamy, you'll need to unmute yourself.
I have muted myself, which is rare. Thanks a lot. Congratulations, Minister, for your very recent promotion. We've all noticed that your portfolio is now larger than climate on the whole area of environment. And this is something we in Jacques Delors, which is, as Kate said, the sister of the Jacques Delors Institute in Brussels, which is dealing with sustainable development. We are very happy to see that environment and climate are now in the same hands. We believe this is a very coherent set of organization. Let me say also that this exchange with Minister Kurtyka follows a previous exchange that took place some time ago between the boss of Jacques Delors in Brussels, Geneviève Pons, and President Duda, before the elections, which was devoted to this question which Minister Kurtyka mentioned, which is how to reconcile a better protection for environment and social justice, which we all know is an issue we all have to work with. Now, to be short, On the first question, which was raised for this discussion, will the EU Green Deal survive the COVID? I think the answer is a clear yes, and I totally agree with Minister Kurtaka that not only has the Green Deal survived the COVID crisis, but the COVID crisis has been an occasion of a reaction after a bit of fuzziness at the beginning of the COVID crisis that will lead to a new momentum for the Green Deal. And this is absolutely clear in what we call in our Brussels jargon, the July package, which is the combination of the recovery plan, the 850 billion that will come from EU pocket to go to the member states pocket, and also the budget 7 years iteration, which also is strongly impacted by this green transition strategy. So, in a nutshell, EU is putting its money where its mouth is, which is a good thing. And I'm not going to say it's a new thing, but I think it's a good thing. And this will accelerate this much needed, at least in the view of Jacques Delors, it's this much needed transition. And by the way, what the Commission tabled for the consideration of the European Council and the European Parliament is very similar to a template which we published in June, which was called Greener After, which was a sort of mood 800 billion investment plan with precise sectors and orientations, creating jobs, things which are ready to launch, and of course, pushing on the green transition. So a clear yes to the third question. As far as the second question, which is a bit more French, and of course, I'm not speaking on behalf of the French government, but I think it's interesting for us all in this discussion to have a look at the similarities and differences between Poland and France in this area of climate change, energy transition, the Green Deal. And looking at the big picture, I found 4 similarities and 4 differences, which I think we should have in mind in looking at the future. First similarity, we have roughly the same level of CO2 emissions. Poland and France domestically emit roughly the same amount of carbon, and this is not counting imported carbon, which of course makes a difference. So this is in common. Where we have a difference is, of course, that the same level of emissions is for 67 million people in France and 40 million in Poland, which results in a higher per head emission in Poland. Another difference is that if you look at recent times, French emissions are roughly slowly decreasing, whereas Polish emissions for the moment are still slowly increasing. Third difference, which has a lot to do with the previous one, which is that our energy mix is very different. We in France have a lot of nuclear energy, which is carbon neutral. You in Poland still have a lot of coal. And I must say, I have to salute and recognize this recent deal between the government and the miners' unions in order to phase out coal in 2049. Many of us will say that this is too far away, and I probably would agree with that. Still, I think it's an inflection which needs to be recognized. Now, whether Minister Kurtyka played a role in this or not, I'm not familiar enough with Polish politics to say, but I think this goes in the right direction. A similarity we have, and which Minister Kurtaka just mentioned, is the fact that both France and Poland see this transition as having a very social component, whether it's the social impact of the transition in the industry, in the energy production sector, or whether it's the impact of this on a poorer household. We both are putting a lot of attention on this, and we in Europe Jacques Delors believe this is the right way to go, and we've been publishing several things on this theme. Where we still have a difference is on the 2030, 55, 60 something percent of decarbonation. I mean, I think France is pushing quite hard for a rather ambitious objective. I understand Poland is still considering its own position. I will finish by two similarities. First, we both have a serious problem with our farming constituency. Both Poland and France are big agricultural producers, and we all know that for the moment, this sector is not very much within carbon reductions, whether it's the ETS, whether it's in whatever system of taxation. So it's something on which we have a problem, and we might discuss this to find solutions. And lastly, there's another area where we have a position in common, which is that, and Minister Kurtyka just mentioned this, we want the carbon price within the European Union to increase, and we need to do that in order to put pressure on our production systems to decarbonize them. But we have a problem with the notion that others would not follow the same path. Hence this border carbon adjustment issue, which both Poland and France are pushing for the reasons which Minister Kurtyka mentioned, which is A, if we don't align our import carbon price on our domestic one, there will be carbon leaks. People will delocalize, produce a lot of carbon elsewhere, and this will not be an environmental positive input. And second, for pure reasons of competitiveness. So on this, we agree. So after having roughly presented these similarities and differences, my own conclusion is that we probably will be now moving in the same direction. Last word on what the French recovery plan contains on this green transition. As far as I see it, it's exactly in line with the EU proportion. Roughly 35% of the EU money has to go to the green transition. In the 100 billion French plan, 30% of the money goes to the green transition. So in this, France is in line with the European strategy. We have a bit of a difference with others on where our priorities are. 2/3 of this 30 billion in France go to a few sectors. I will just mention them. Green tech is number one with 6 billion. Decarbonization of buildings, whether public buildings, housing, school, poor household benefiting from a 2 billion specific plan, which fits with what we said previously about the social impact of the green transition. 2 billion for hydrogen, 2 billion for clean motorization, and this has been a matter of discussion in France, 5 billion for the modernization of the railway station, the railway system, which of course competes with road transport and is a big issue. So that's my contribution at this stage of the discussion. My conclusion, as far as France is concerned, I think as far as Europe is concerned, and I believe listening to the minister as far as Poland is concerned, is that we should not see this sort of Green Deal strategy as something negative, as something we need to do in order not to sin, I think we should see this as a formidable opportunity to modernize our production systems and to regain a leadership in the international economy, which unfortunately for the last decades we've lost. I think this is perfectly doable, and a European strategy, I think, remains the best way to do that. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lamy. Just a reminder to our audience that if you have a question for either of our panelists, you can ask it by going to the YouTube live stream of the event and posting your question in the comments section there. I'd love to kick off the discussion with a question about what's happening this week, today, in fact, in European climate politics. European Parliament will vote today on the EU's new 2030 climate target. The Commission has already proposed that this new target should be an emissions cut of at least 55% by the end of the decade from 1990 levels. And that target also needs approval from member states. So, Minister Kurtaka, all eyes are on Poland here. Poland was the only country that didn't officially commit to the EU's 2050 climate goal. And I'd love to hear your view on whether Poland is open to the 55% emissions target for 2030, and what do you need to see from the EU in terms of funding or the design of the policy to feel comfortable signing up to deeper emissions cuts?
Thank you very much. We are determined to play our part in collective European ambition of reaching climate neutrality by 2050. What we said in December last year is that Poland has a different starting point, and Pascal described it perfectly. When French energy mix is composed in 75% of nuclear, Polish energy mix still 30 years after the transition is composed of 75% of coal. And this is due to the fact that we were the only country within the Soviet bloc which was not allowed to, in fact, develop any other source of energy. All our neighbors, Czechoslovakia at that time, when you speak about Central European countries, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, when you speak right now about Ukraine, Lithuania, all of them had the nuclear power, not Poland. 97% of our electricity was provided by coal in 1989, and it was relatively new installations. And so we didn't have ability to move out from this system, as for years, for the last 30 years, Poland is also the country which is where households are paying quite a big share of their revenues on energy. It's 10% in average, to be compared with 5% of households' revenues spent on energy in Germany, for example. So it's much more difficult for us to get the resources necessary for this move. But right now it's happening. Why? Because all the installations are getting older, and because the conditions in terms of economic growth, in terms of availability of funds, are really here. So right now we are championing the development of renewables. It was not Reuters, but Bloomberg 1 month ago published a report saying that Poland is the star of green investments in Europe. Between 2019 and 2024, 65% of installed green capacity will be increased. We just celebrated 10,000 megawatts of installed capacities in renewables. That is more than Denmark. And we have in months where we have a lot of wind. In last February, we had already 30% of electricity stemming from renewables. So I think in this regard, Poland's stereotypical view, which is then also very much exacerbated by the photos that we are seeing all the times when you have an article published about public transformation and focusing on minors. but minors were 400,000 in 1989. There are 80,000 right now. And we are working hand in hand with them. And thank you very much, Pascal, for noticing the deal. It's really a turning point for this industry in Poland. And right now, many things will be happening very well. This is being said, and thank you, answering to your question. 55% is a big stretch. It will not be a stretch for our colleagues in Finland or Sweden who declared climate neutrality by 2035 or 2045. But again, for a country where the starting point is different, it's difficult. Not because we are not changing the energy system, but don't forget that 2/3 of Polish energy bills are not being paid for electricity, are being paid for heat. And changing heat is much more complicated, that it's much more complicated to get green heat. Because that the challenge is on both sides, energy efficiency of buildings, but also ability to switch to ecological boilers and to get rooftop PVs, heat pumps, etc. We need simply to have enough resources for this switch to be happening. And we are speaking about millions of people. Yes, we are less numerous than our French colleagues, but nevertheless, we are 40 million people. And we have 3 million houses which require deep thermomodernization. That's a lot of money. So there are challenges that we need to face. And when you compare the cost of reaching already the objective of 40% by 2030, you see that compared with to GDP in Poland is twice as much as Western European average. Not speaking about Netherlands, where it's 3 times less in terms of GDP share of what is needed for this transition to be a successful one. So we are facing objective problems, and what we are bringing to the table in this European discussion is, of course, Polish sensitivities and special starting point, but also, I think, good questions. How realistic are our assumptions when we speak sector by sector? How are we going to move chemistry, transport, energy-intensive industries, fertilizers, cement, steel? All these are questions which need to be answered in details. And I think it's good for European project that we are having the capacity of answer these questions. And we want these answers truly to be bringing, again, as I said in the beginning, European competitiveness. So I know that time is running. Just last things. We have published our energy strategy. It is within 20 years to build a new zero-emission energy system. Within 20 years, build the same system of the same size that we built in the last 60 or even 70 years. Second, making full use of just transition. So we have to create as many jobs in new sectors as we are losing in existing sectors. It's an enormous economic stretch and challenge. And thirdly, we need in Poland here to combat our biggest problem, which is air quality. So radically improve air quality, and it rhymes very well with climate objectives. So in this regard, environment and climate under the same portfolio in Polish government, I think it's a very good news.
Minister, thank you. A question about money then, and this massive funding package that Mr. Lamy mentioned earlier. EU countries agreed in the summer to 1.8 trillion euros, comprising a coronavirus economic recovery fund and the next EU budget. So they also said that 30% of this will go to climate action. So there's a lot of money on offer for green growth at the moment from the EU. A question for both panelists, which specific projects and areas should France and Poland be focusing on in their recovery plans to ensure that their recovery from the coronavirus pandemic is a green one?
If I may answer this question, you're right, Kate. There's an enormous amount of money stemming from this recovery package. This is an add-up to existing money EU money in structural funds, part of which goes to the green transition, in the Just Transition Fund, which goes to green transition, and to the European Trading Scheme Fund, which, as you know, makes a bit of money in carbon certificates and emissions, and which also brings money to this sector. So when I said the EU is putting its money where its mouth is, there are now plenty of resources. And the question is, where do you put them? In the piece Europe Delors published in June, and which I already said inspired the EU Commission proposal, we made a few very specific proposals, which is sectors that meet three conditions: shovel-ready projects, green transition, and job creation, not least to address the formidable economic and social shock with the COVID crisis represents. If you do for each country the math, and if you look at the sectors which meet the three conditions, you get roughly what the French program entails, starting with something which is formidably costly, but incredibly profitable in terms of CO2 emission, which is energy saving in buildings, whether public or private. Then you have the whole mobility sector, rail, road, batteries, charger infrastructures. And then you have one sector which we mentioned and which also is a part of the Mission Ocean, which I have the privilege to share proposals, which is to use a part of this money on coastal tourism in Europe, which is a sector which has been horribly hit by the crisis and which needs a lot of decarbonization. So these are a few examples, but, and on this I totally agree with Minister Kurtyka, money is not the only issue. It's one issue, which is a major issue, but you have a whole set of regulatory issues, norm standards, including this border carbon adjustment system. And if I may, I would appreciate the view of Minister Kurtyka on this border carbon adjustment system. As I said already, we published a template for that a few months ago, and we, at the time, were the only ones to propose a full-fledged WTO-compatible border carbon adjustment. If Minister Kurtyka has a view on this, I would appreciate and start building a dialogue on how to move this forward.
Thank you very much. Starting from the last, indeed, carbon border adjustment system is the right way to protecting and transitioning from the existing system to new system, at the same time preserving European competitiveness, but also impacting, let's say, the ambition, the climate ambition of third countries. Because ultimately, if we want to succeed, we need also to have others on board. And I think that in this regard, carbon border adjustment system as proposed is an excellent idea. We can imagine some sectors where pilots could be done, so steel and cement. I think also fertilizers, as fertilizers are extremely gas intensive in terms of production. So there are a couple of sectors that we should target and then make sure that we learn, because it will be a complicated regulatory challenge. And Pascal, you are the best place to be able to appreciate the regulatory complexity of this mechanism. That's and answering directly your question, Kate, on similarities between Poland and France, I think I would add another point on what is a similarity between Poland and France. it's growing emissions from the transport sector. Transport sector is one of the biggest contributor to the increase of emissions within European Union and between Poland and France, including Poland and France. Or we have an interesting technology in which, moreover, Europe started to invest heavily. In 2019, for the first time, European investments in electromobility surpassed by 3.5 times Chinese ones. We invested 60 billion euro in electromobility at the same time as our Chinese counterparts invested 17 billion. So we need to do something on the transport agenda, and we need to do it quickly. One of the objectives I settled up in Polish energy policy plan is to eliminate combustion buses from tenders in Polish agglomerations by 2025 already. So only moving to hydrogen and electric buses. And we see in Polish case that it has an enormous industrial potential as well, as Poland has become right now also the biggest producer of electric buses within European Union. So it can work. We can combine ecological, societal, and economic objectives. Second issue is the word has not been mentioned, but when we are speaking about Poland and France, I think we should not forget nuclear. Nuclear, which is the basis of French energy mix, which is right now looked in a bit shy manner by my colleagues from France. Or we know it will be extremely complicated, if it's not impossible, to move to climate neutrality without nuclear, and some solutions will need to be found out also at the European level for this. And last but not least, I believe very much in concrete industrial ventures, and we can make them around storage, biogas, hydrogen, solar, and we spoke about it with our French colleagues, including during the visit of President Macron in January this year, when I engaged this dialogue with Bruno Le Maire and also my counterpart in the Ministry of Environment right now, which changed, and it's Madame Barbara Pompili, who will be taking over this duty. So we should strive for concrete industrial alliances and coalitions in order to build future together.
Minister, thank you very much. I'll now turn over to some questions from our viewers who are sending them in through YouTube. One question relates to the deal that has been already mentioned between the Polish government and coal mining unions. This is a deal that would gradually close the country's mines by 2049. The question is, will the recent deal between the Polish government and the miner unions have an impact on the government's stance on climate and energy targets, both domestically and on a European level?
Thank you. I think we are used in Poland to face enormous transitions, and we adapted to such a transition from centrally driven political economy of communist Soviet time to a market economy. It was painful, but we succeeded in it, and we did it in full respect of social dialogue and doing our best not to leave people behind. We have the experience of this transition. It was a painful transition. It was not as we would wish in many cases to run the next one. So this is why we are taking the necessary time to discuss with our social partners, with trade unions, with miners, in order to organize this transition as we can best. So right now, the deal which was signed provides with constraints, with let's say, the frame. And within this frame, the whole deal has to be made. And we will be seeing the whole picture by 15th of December. So then I'll be very happy to answer your question, as right now it's still going on, how to organize it, what is the economic impact, what is the societal impact, how can we fully transfer the outcome of this social negotiation to our policy. We will be able to tell you by the end of the year when the full agreement will be known. But I think it's already now bringing a lot of dynamics around this energy policy that I have published as Ministry of Climate. And we see that it is being taken as really the baseline for Polish evolution and transformation of energy, transport, and other systems.
Thank you. Another question from our viewers. Do you agree that support for the transition towards a zero emissions economy requires the redirection of all EU funds solely towards objectives that are consistent with the Green Deal? We had a few other questions in the chat asking about fossil fuel related investments. So I'd be interested to hear both of your thoughts on that.
Thank you very much. Yes, I mean, we feel the responsibility on our shoulders. Traditionally, EU budget was very much run and managed in its lion's share by ministers of agriculture. And starting from the next perspective, it will be ministers responsible with climate, green transition, which will be responsible for managing 30%, as was said of EU funds. It's an enormous responsibility that we have to face. And of course, there are very many practical questions. For example, gas. For us, gas is a transition fuel. It's a regulatory fuel, which helps to regulate, to moderate renewables. But it's also the only viable, technically and economically, alternative to coal heating. So if we want, for example, to eradicate problems with air quality in Poland, we need to switch from coal in individual heating to gas. And how to do it without proper financing. And that's a very concrete example of a question where we have to think together. And we are not saying that these people will be staying with gas forever. It's not the will, it's not the purpose of the game. But switching directly from coal to heat pump is simply extremely expensive. And for majority of households in Poland, unavailable. So we need to go step by step. So I think that we should be very pragmatic when thinking about on which purposes this money can be used or not.
Thank you. If I could just ask a follow-up to that, there are some concerns, particularly from environmental campaigners, that gas, if used as a transition fuel, if we build new gas infrastructure, they say there's a risk that we could lock in emissions for decades. And I just kind of wondered, in the context of climate neutrality, given that gas is not a zero emissions fuel unless it's used with carbon capture storage, how long is this bridge from gas to zero carbon sources of energy?
Excellent question. We have published the main principles for our hydrogen policy. And we want, for example, by 2030 to have between 2,000 and 4,000 megawatts of installed capacity in electrolyzers. But we want also to have 10% of our networks to be adapted to transport decarbonized gases. And we want also to have a pilot cogeneration power plant, so a plant which is able to produce both electricity and heat of at least 50 megawatts, which will be hydrogen driven. So so we have to move forward our technologies. We have to be able to bring new technologies in the game, especially hydrogen, but also biogas. We are working on a very important support strategy for biogas. So it will be a decarbonized gas in terms of its origin, and we want to be able to gradually increase the share of decarbonized gases in our energy mix. And of course, gas infrastructure, well, I think that the question is answered differently in France, where a majority of households are connected or could be connected to the gas network if they wish, and in Poland, where we still have 60%, as much as, or as at least only 60% of people who are connected to gas pipelines. And one of the objectives by 2030 is to connect 1.5 million Polish families to the gas network, because it's a must-have alternative to coal heating in many places in Poland, economically, technically, and in terms of support or supply of fuel. So I think we need to be really extremely practical in answering this question, but keeping the eyes on the horizon and on the objective of climate neutrality.
If I may on this one, and before we close, I think there is, as we all know, a debate going on in the European Parliament on this. And especially on whether or not EU money, as part of the Green Deal, should finance gas. And the debate started with an old provisional financial resources, which is the European Investment Bank. So in Europe, Jacques Delors, because of our sustainability commitment, my answer on this would be we are waiting to see where the majority of the European Parliament will go, which for us would be a big element of appreciation.
Thank you. Mr. Lamy, I'll put another question from our viewers to you. This one is about nuclear projects, which is a key part of the discussions on the low carbon transition in France. The viewer asks, can finance for nuclear projects become part of the EU effort, that its Green Deal effort, or is this discussion closed? And I wondered if, maybe from the French perspective, you could say a bit about the plans to scale back nuclear generation and how France is planning to do that without replacing it with energy sources that produce more emissions. Thank you.
Well, very short answer. One, I agree with what Minister Kurtyka said about the nuclear option. I can hardly see how we can move to zero carbon in 2050 without nuclear, although I also recognize that stocking nuclear waste is a problem which so far has not been well addressed. And while not speaking for the French government, Minister Kurtyka is speaking for the Polish government. I'm not speaking for the French government, but what I see as the French policy is at least closing old nuclear installations, the safety of which may be less assured than modern ones, and I think this is the way to go.
Thank you very much. We're already 5 minutes over time, so I'm sorry to those viewers who didn't get to ask their question, but that's all we've got time for, and I will hand back to Lucas to conclude our event. Thanks very much to both of our panelists.
Yeah, Our two honorable panelists agreed on many points, and one of the points regarding the climate transition was that money is an issue, but it's not the only one issue. The time is another issue for sure, and it goes also for our debate. So unfortunately, we have to close this fascinating discussion. So I would like to really thank our panelists, including Moderator, Kate, for your expertise, for your clarifications, and also to all participants for the engagement. Very interesting and many questions. We had a very good turnout, around 80 persons that stayed with us until the end. So that's a good news. It's an interesting topic, and this is also what we would like to invest more at PISM, moreover at PISM Brussels office. So please stay tuned for the following events organized by our office, and we hope also for the next occasions for cooperation with our French friends, Jacques Delors. So thank you so much for this time cooperation. Thank you all, and please stay tuned for another events concerning this extremely important issue.
And let me,
European agenda. Yeah, sure.
Lucas, let me wish good luck to Iga Swiatek, who's in 20 minutes starting her quarter final in the Roland Garros tournament. She's a brilliant tennis player, so we will watch her and support her, even if she's playing against an Italian. For the sake of today, we will support her.
I really appreciate that. Moreover, that there is no anymore French players. So I really appreciate that you will cross fingers for our Polish one. This is really a great celebration for us, and we cross fingers for Kinga. Thank you so much. We're going to close the event. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.